Before we get started with that, however, we're fortunate to kind of get a double dip today. We've got a new temporary display being opened up. It's on fighting presidents. And the man that actually was a big part in making this display a reality is going to go ahead and cut the ribbon for us, Mr. Brooke Anderson. He also happens to be the man that is taking part in today's program. So before we get started over here, we're going to just direct your attention right over to this side.
Thanks, Greg. Actually, two of us are going to open this display today. I'm going to ask General Patton to work with me on it. Glad he's here today. But what we're doing here, this will be a new temporary display. It'll be up about 3 months. The idea behind it is that it honors America's fighting presidents from George Washington on. Those men who ultimately became a president of the United States, fought for their countries. Basically, the main... Oh. Then as well, we're recognizing those who served on active duty in the U.S. military and also men who later became presidents who were in the various militia or National Guard units. It's an interesting display. Tom Miller worked with me very closely on this. He's a wonderful researcher, and he's put together an awful lot of really good, detailed information. I would really hope all of you would have a chance to take a look at. As well, we've done a little bit of trivia on U.S. presidents just so you can kind of have some fun. There's a yellow submarine up here, which, what's a submarine doing? Well, it's actually talking about presidents who at one point in time were involved with a submarine, such as George H.W. Bush, who was the first president of the United States to actually be rescued by a submarine. So at any rate, without any further ado, as we always do, we just cut the ribbon and open the display. Thank you all.
Thank you, Brooke. All right, so let's go ahead and continue on now, and we'll get started with today's VE Day program. Once again, I thank everybody for coming. It's wonderful to see you all here. I know that you have plenty of places you could be, and you chose to be with us, so we thank you very much for that. Once again, my name is Greg Kenny. I'm the Education Coordinator here at the museum. And it's my honor and privilege to introduce the programs, and I get to be involved in the programs as far as the setup and you know, putting up the speakers and everything like that. And today I actually get to do a little bit of the speaking. I'm very excited about that as well. But before I go any further, we're going to have a presentation of our colors today from Desert Hot Springs High School's MCJ ROTC cadets. So if you will all please rise with me, they're going to come on in and we will do the Pledge of Allegiance once they post it. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Carry, colors. Ready, cut, right, peace. Forward, march.
Thank you. Desert Hot Springs High School, MCJ ROTC. Ladies and gentlemen, you may be seated. And while you're making yourselves comfortable, if you wouldn't mind just muting the cell phones for the duration of the program, I know the speakers would certainly appreciate it. I just want to thank Desert Hot Springs High School one more time. This is the last time we'll get a chance to see them this season. They've done color guard for us several times for these programs, and they've been absolutely superb every time. So just one more quick hand for them if you wouldn't mind. It's fantastic. At this point in my introduction, I also like to make sure that I make a special point of thanking a few people that I can see some of them in the audience here today. Of course, our volunteers, the ladies and gentlemen in the white shirts with the white name tags that show up in the dedication every day. They had a ceremony this morning for those that had given over 10,000 hours, and I believe we had 23 of them on our roster. So, I mean, just amazing commitment from the volunteers. Thank you. Of course, all museum members, and of course, members of our board of directors, our museum board as well. These are all the people that make this place tick, that make this place run, from the planes to the programs. We couldn't do it without them. So I'm very thankful personally for all of those I just mentioned. So, all right, well now let me give you just a real quick rundown of what we have in store for you today with today's program. I'm very excited about what we have to share with you today. We have some fantastic photographs. Now these are photos never before seen by the public, and they're going to help us tell the story of the events, basically from D-Day, but we're going to abbreviate a little bit because these photos are very lengthy. We've picked a few of the best, but they're going to help us tell the story of how we got to VE Day. And Mr. Brooke Anderson, who we met before there, if you have not met him already, he's going to add just a few words to these photographs. I mean, these photos tell 1,000 words on their own. And Brooke is just going to keep them in context for us. You'll see the pictures as we go along, and I don't want to jump the gun on them. These are absolutely fantastic photos, and I don't envy Brooke in having to select from over 400 photos down to just a few that we'll get to see today. But I think you'll agree with me that they are very, very illustrative of what the war was like in Europe. As I said before, I get to be in on the act a little bit today. I'm going to try very briefly to provide a timeline for us from the symbolic link-up between the Russians and the Americans at Torgau up to the actual surrender on VE Day. So I'm going to just give us a brief timeline to see, how did these events actually take place. I thought it was going to be a very simple job. When I started reading the books, it was kind of a convoluted process. So I'm going to try to do a little explanation there. But really, I am not the highlight of this program. We've got 3 guests with us here today, all of which were in the European Theater of Operations at the end of the war, all of which were serving our country bravely, and all of which, like I said, are here today, and we are so honored and so glad to have them. I'll mention them here quickly, and we will obviously get to hear from them towards the latter part of the program. I'm very excited to hear from them. Let's see, we've got Mr. Chuck Lawley here today. Chuck was a B-24 pilot, shot down, and was held as a POW in Germany. We've got Mr. Bob Orton here today. Mr. Bob Orton was a half-track driver. He was with General Patton's 6th Armored Division. And we've got Mr. Wayne Hoffman. He was an officer with the 1st Division, the Big Red One. He's with us here today. And I just would also mention that he's also on our board, and he was also the generous donor of that beautiful airplane that you see back behind us there with the wooden prop, that Stearman. So we're very thankful for Mr. Hoffman, of course, as well as all of our guests here today. And before I finish my thank yous, I want to make sure that I thank these 3 gentlemen properly. The museum has a small token of our appreciation for them. We've got a couple of medallions. They're emblazoned with the Air Museum logo, and they're inscribed with the letters VIP. And, well, that is what these gentlemen are, and we're very thankful to have them. I'd like to present them to them right now. Okay, and as if that wasn't enough, I think everybody heard the C-53 pull up outside there. We've got that here today after the speaking program. She's going to take off from the ramp, make a few passes, come back in, and be open to the public. Now, if anybody saw it come in, I bet you a lot of us thought that that was a C-47. But I'm told that is a C-53. And I'd kind of like to know the difference. I did a little research on my own, and there are some differences between a C-47 and a C-53. If you join us outside on the ramp after the program today, we can learn what they are, climb up inside the planes, and kind of get to see hands-on for ourselves. I know we've got some people here today that actually flew some of these airplanes. So I think we've got a really great program, and I don't want to be up here any longer than I have to be. So I'm going to go ahead right now and turn it over to Mr. Anderson. Brooke, will you come on up?
Greetings from Mr. Electronically Challenged. I hope I can get everything working for you today, but thank you so much for coming. It's great to see everybody here. There we go. Okay. We're starting with sort of an overview map of the European situation. We're going to move rapidly to one outfit, the 69th Infantry Division, and its march through Germany. Now, the D-Day, of course, was, to me, the first signal that Hitler's empire was crumbling and that he faced what no military leader wants to face, and that's a two-front war. So since we're talking about VE Day, I thought that we'd have a little formula, which is that D-Day equals VE Day, because that's what it took. We broke the wall of Festung Europa, Fortress Europe, and moved on. What happened, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, was that the American and Commonwealth troops moved from the west to the east, and the Soviets moved from the east to the west. Now, the 69th, I hope you can see this fairly well, because this is the latter part of the movement of the 69th Infantry Division through Europe. Now, we've chosen the 69th for two very good reasons. Number one, they were the infantry division that actually linked up with the Soviets at Torgau. That was on April 25th, 1945. And in essence, that link-up was the symbolic end of World War II, as the pincers had closed and Germany was crushed between these two dynamic forces. And of course, VE Day itself came a scant 2 weeks later. The photographs we're going to be seeing were taken by Robert Goldfein, who was attached to the 69th Artillery Group. They were donated by his son, Stuart Goldfein, who's with us here today. I'd like Stuart to stand up and just say hello. Stuart. Thanks a lot, Stuart. It's a fantastic collection. There's about 425 photographs. We're still working on identifying them. We've probably got 35 to 40% of them ID'd already as to where they were and what was happening. Also, if you have time and want to go to the 69th Division website, you'll find some of these photographs shown there with identifications as to where they were and essentially at what time. As well as Stuart's wonderful donation, I think there's another gentleman in the audience today. I hope he's here. Dave Phillips. Dave, are you here? I guess he's not. I want to thank Dave. Dave's a professional photographer from Chicago who's worked very closely with me in improving and getting high-res scans of some of these photos. So thanks again, Dave. Now these photos, as Greg said, these photos have really never before been seen publicly. So you're really going to have a wonderful opportunity today to see a very good photographer at work showing what happened as the boys moved eastward. We're captioned, so perhaps I don't need to talk about every one. If you have any questions, if I don't mention it, just raise your hand and I'll try and elaborate on the slide. One thing I found interesting, the 69th Artillery, that's where Bob Goldfein was attached. They also had anti-aircraft weapons. The Ma-Deuce that you see here, a water-cooled 50 cal machine gun, was actually used as an anti-aircraft weapon. And you can see that these fellows have already scored a couple of victories.
Excuse me, Brooke. Could you read the captions? It's a little hard to see all the way back.
Oh, that's okay. All right. Dave wants me to let me read the captions, so I'll go ahead and do that. Starting from here. This is some of the 69th tanks on the move. Goldfein was an excellent photographer, And if you can see the picture well enough, you'll see the juxtaposition of a very young man and a very large tank, which I thought was very well done. This was, I believe, was in Leipzig, and they were forming up. So you can see the tank starting to move. The building in the background is the one you saw beforehand, with just a single tank with the child. Here we're a welcoming sight of 2 less Panzers to fight our troops. These are patrol vehicles in one of the many villages through which the 69th traveled, simply preparing for another day of action. Somewhat of a staged photograph, but it does give you an idea both of you know, how the men could fight and also some of the weaponry. There were two very important members of every outfit. One member was the chaplain, the other member was the medic. And I found this picture particularly evocative because if you look at the face of the medic, you can see what he went through. These are surrender flags. I have read somewhere that when American troops approached a village, that the people in the village would put out white surrender flags. I'd read that. I'd never been able to prove it one way or the other until Bob Goldfein's photograph indicated that that's exactly what happened. And here you can see everybody letting him know, I surrender. But not dear. One of the major aspects of our victory was our ability to supply our troops. And here in the middle of everything, you can see a camouflaged field kitchen in which they could actually provide the troops with hot chow. Now, I found an interesting comment from one of the 69 vets. He said, quartermaster and ordnance men kept ammunition and supplies coming. Cooks kept the men in chow, hot sometimes, and medics saved lives. Somebody up there liked us. I thought that was a pretty good comment. Speaking of hot chow, this one I really like. I don't think that kid can actually shave, you know, right? But there were a lot of close shaves in battle, but this was a good close shave. Bob Goldfein was very good at showing the guys, and I wish I could share them all with you. There's a bunch of really wonderful photographs. Talk about a lucky guy. Who got a hot bath in the field? Not too many. So you can see that smile on his face is a real smile. Yeah, I don't know. I can't tell what the building was. I looked at several other photos, and I couldn't tell if it was a kitchen or some type of a factory or what. He didn't care. The flip side of the coin, and the not so happy side of the coin, was that those of you that were there, those of you that have studied history, know that the devastation was just really incredible, the destruction. And this is a beautifully framed shot with one poor guy with 2 suitcases saying, where do I go now? Costly. Here you see a German family with a small cart trundling what's left of their goods, trying to find a place to live, period. It was also costly. This was shot in Leipzig.
Oh, really? Okay. Sorry about that. I want everybody to see these great photos.
Oh, wait a second. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so at any rate, we're back. The 69th moved into Leipzig. That was one of the major captures on the way to Torgau. Now, since Bob Goldfein was in the artillery, he, of course, knew the guys in the artillery, including one of the forward air observers, Al Feisen. So Bob was able to fly over Leipzig with Al in the Piper. Bob, what was the military term for those planes? The L5. He was able to go over Leipzig in the L5 and get some pretty interesting pictures of the devastation of Leipzig itself. speaks for itself. That is a captured symbol of the pending defeat, and I think Stuart will agree with me that the man on the right is his father, Robert Goldfein, who not only took pictures, but was able to get in some pictures as well. This is interesting. I've been a collector of militaria all my life, and I had never seen this leaflet until preparation for this particular program. This is the German phonetic spelling for the troops to be able to say, "I surrender." So it would be clearly understood by American and British and Commonwealth troops. I've never seen that. It was in a book called May 8th, 1945, which is an excellent book I can recommend if you're interested in that period and the end of the war. And you know what? It worked. Prisoners, more prisoners, and even more prisoners. And high-ranking prisoners as well. This was in, I can't think of the name of the town right now, Naumburg, I believe was the name of the town. It's a high-ranking officer and his entire staff. Now, this map, just to kind of get back to 1945, late 44 and 45 in particular, you can see here on the map, you've got Berlin in the middle and Torgau just south of Berlin. You've got the Allies, the Commonwealth and the US to the west. You've got the Soviets to the east. And you've still got a lot of Germany that is unconquered. This is 12/15/1944. Let's go move up 4 months. And this is the advance of the Soviets to the east and the Allies to the west coming in on Torgau. They've got the 12th German Army captured right between them, and it's just a matter of days. This kind of gives you a relationship of Torgau itself in terms of its location to Berlin. Now, when they got to Torgau, which is on the Elbe River, the bridges had all been bombed and destroyed. The Soviets, being the Soviets, refused to come to our side of the river. So we had to go to their side of the river, and they were accommodating enough to at least build a few rafts for us so we could get over without wet feet. And I don't know if you can see it in the picture or not, but this is sort of your typical method of crossing a river when there's no bridge, and it's the rope from one side to the other and moving the raft along that rope. The 69th Division Engineers erected this sign, "East meets West," and here you see what I would consider to be a good symbolic picture of that link-up, which was basically the end of the war in Germany. Soldiers being soldiers, they got together, and the first thing they did was trade pictures of the wives and kids. Now, I've always liked this picture. It's just, these are Soviet troops, ground pounders, grunts, and I keep thinking about these guys. They have the Germans in front of them and the commissars behind them driving it forward. It was tough for everybody, but we didn't have commissars behind us, thank God. This is the meeting of the two generals. The man to the right, facing next to the Soviet, that is General Emil Reinhardt, who was the commanding officer of the 69th Division. The Russian Soviet officer to his right is General Rusakov, who was the commanding officer of the 58th Guards Division. And this link-up ceremony lasted probably 2 to 3, maybe 4 days. They flew VIPs in from all over. But this was the beginning between the 69th and the 58th. So these are really, very significant and unusual pictures to see. I'm showing this picture again, I'm going to brag a little bit. I was extremely lucky to be able to attend the 60th anniversary of the link-up. I went to Torgau on the Elbe and joined some people from the 69th Division. So we have the link-up in April of 45. I can't say those are the same guys, but I'd like to. But it was just wonderful to be with them. The Soviets used a lot of women on the front. They took a lot of the jobs. that freed men to pick up a rifle and charge. And so here you see just a man and woman in the Soviet Army, and 60 years later, I'd like to say those are the same two people as well. But I do think it's quite an evocative picture. I think the phases are wonderful. It was a great opportunity. That concludes our little tour through Germany with the 69th, and I want to turn it over to Greg now and get back to the balance of the program, which covers the actual leading up to the treaties themselves. So, Greg? Thank you. Thank you very much. Greg? He's silent.
Sneaky. Thank you, Brooke. That was great. I think my words were probably pretty appropriate in the beginning. 1,000 words for each picture, I think, would have been a minimum. And they tell a great story of how we got to the point that the war was going to be over in Europe. As Brooke said, that handshake was a very symbolic end of the war. The Russians, the Americans had linked up. But we have to have a literal end to the war. This wasn't VE Day. So I've got a little timeline of deaths and surrenders. It sounds rather grim in one aspect, but it was rather grim, fortunately. Because the first death we're going to talk about, of course, was the Fuhrer himself. 25th was the link up at Torgau, 25th of April, 1945. Mere 5 days later, Adolf Hitler is in Berlin, in the Fuhrer bunker, there with his new bride, and I think we all know exactly where they went on their honeymoon, so to speak. Follow my drift, went down. Anyway, Hitler, before his death, left an outline for who he thought should be in charge of Germany after his demise. He sort of split the power. He didn't name anybody to become the Fuhrer. He named two people to sort of share the power. One of them was the man formerly in charge of the German Navy, Admiral Dönitz. The other one was the man that was in charge of propaganda for Germany, and that was Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels, apparently not being very fond of the job, as you can see up there, committed suicide the day after getting it, leaving Admiral Dönitz in charge. So the war is coming to an end. It's going to be Admiral Dönitz, the one that's going to have to actually decide how are we going to try to manipulate this to our best advantage. And so that's exactly what he's going to try to do. So here's how it sort of unfolded from there. Admiral Dönitz is not in Berlin, he's in Flensburg, which is up near the Danish border. And that's the point from which he's going to be calling the shots, from here to the literal end of war in Europe. May 1st, the German forces in Italy surrendered. Remember, the Italians had surrendered long ago, but the Germans continued fighting. May 1st, they formally surrendered. Negotiations had been going on secretly for the past month. Part of the reason why Hitler named Admiral Dönitz was because the German army and the German SS had been working behind Hitler's back to surrender. And so after Hitler's suicide has been formally announced to the people, very quickly you'll start to see these surrenders, sort of like dominoes falling. So here we have one. The next one on May 2nd. The German forces fighting in Berlin surrender. The general in charge there and his staff come out and present themselves to the Soviets. At this point, I think it behooves me to mention that this was the last thing that the Germans wanted to do, was to surrender to the Soviets. They knew what sort of fighting had gone on in Russia. They knew the millions upon millions of Russian lives that had been sacrificed in the fighting that had gone on in Moscow, in Stalingrad, and then the fight all the way back. The Russians had pushed them all the way back, and it was the Russians that were in Berlin. So this is the last thing that the German army wants to do, is to surrender to these same Russians. On May 4th, you've got another massive surrender. Now these are individual surrenders in individual areas, not an overarching German surrender. May 4th, you've got the forces in northwestern Germany surrender. They try to negotiate as well, because they're surrendering to Field Marshal Montgomery. They want to try to negotiate so they can just surrender to the Western Allies, but continue fighting the Russians, trying to buy themselves time to surrender as many people as they can and escape to the West. The communists are coming. We're going to lose one way or another. We want to play this to our advantage if you're of the German mindset. The other thing that they had in their minds were, there was a possibility, to their mindset anyway, that the Americans and the British might end up fighting the Russians before this thing was all over. And there's a possibility that, hey, maybe the Germans can join with the Americans and the Brits and fight the Russians. Maybe we can negotiate things to our best advantage. So these are all the things that are going on through Admiral Donitz's mind while the surrender is becoming more and more and more imminent. When northwestern Germany surrenders, that's up where Admiral Donitz is now. He knows it's just going to be a matter of time before there are troops knocking at his door. So we've basically come to a point where he realizes we need to make the big surrender. We're going to surrender all of the Reich. Germany is going to surrender. The time has come to sign on the dotted line, so to speak. So word is sent from Admiral Donitz's headquarters out to the major Allied capitals. And at this point, I'll pause just very briefly to tell sort of an interesting story. When I was reading about this subject, they were talking about when the word finally arrived at Prime Minister Churchill's quarters, it came late in the evening, and I believe it was on May 6th. And it wasn't Churchill that received the notice, obviously, directly. He had, his staff that received it. And his staff was faced with quite a conundrum. See, Churchill had issued standing orders that had been in place throughout the war that he was not to be disturbed once he'd retired for the evening. Once he's gone to bed, you don't bother Prime Minister Churchill, unless England is being invaded. Well, this is a surrender. This is huge news, right? But it's not an invasion. Do we wake the Prime Minister up? And the decision was made, no. We don't wake the Prime Minister up. So that night he slept unaware that the Germans were going to surrender. The next morning, he gets up, he goes to his map room for his morning briefings, and there's a Captain Pym there. Captain Pym's job is to pass along the news of what happened overnight while the Prime Minister was sleeping. He gives him the news. Prime Minister, the Germans are prepared to surrender. Prime Minister Churchill's response, Captain Pym, for the last 5 years, every morning you've given me bad news. Some days, worse than others. This morning, sir, you have finally redeemed yourself. I thought it was sort of an interesting story that I can absolutely envision in my mind happening. Anyway, so now the news is out there. The Germans want to surrender. As I said before, they don't want to surrender unconditionally. They'd like to have as many conditions as they can get to play it to their advantage. But unconditional is the only surrender that we're going to accept. This has been the policy. Brief glance at my notes here. Yes, January 1943, at the conference in Casablanca, President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, declared the only surrender we'll accept is unconditional. Once again, February 1945 at the Yalta Conference, this time with Stalin present with Roosevelt and Churchill. The only surrender we will accept is unconditional, no negotiations. As we may or may not be aware, President Roosevelt passed away in April of 1945. Vice President Truman becomes president and reiterates the policy. The only surrender we will accept is unconditional. So that's pretty much the end of negotiations, right? Unconditional surrender is the only thing we'll accept. Let's sign the paperwork. Let's get this thing going. We're only going to take unconditional surrender, sign it, get it over with. But as with so many things in life, nothing is easy. There are 2 surrender signings. The first one takes place on May 7th in Reims, France. This is where General Eisenhower's Supreme Allied headquarters are. It's a little red schoolhouse building. The paperwork is there. Admiral Dönitz himself is not there. He sends General Jodl. General Jodl has 2 instructions. 1, try to negotiate. And 2, if you cannot negotiate, if you cannot get any terms, wire to me, let me know, and then go ahead and sign the paperwork. All right, fine. Jodl tries to negotiate for terms. He isn't given any. Interestingly enough, this is the exact same shoe on the other foot when the Germans forced the French to surrender in 1940, and Jodl was there for that. He gave the French no conditions either. So now it's his turn to face the music, so to speak. Jodl is there. He does sign. Obviously, he got permission from Dönitz. He does sign. The paperwork is signed, but there is a problem. The problem is, 1, the Russians object. They have a representative there. We all, for the Americans, I believe it was Walter Beadle Smith that was there. There was representatives from the Allies there. But the feeling was, 1, there wasn't a high enough ranking Russian general there, and 2, the Russians wanted it in Berlin. We want it in the German capital. We don't want it to take place in France. So Stalin is basically saying, no, 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 we're not going to accept this surrender. We need a whole other surrender document to be signed. The other consideration that came into play and why May 7th was not universally accepted as a surrender date was because General Jodl, the general signing for the German side, was not of high enough stature, meaning he could not make the command decisions needed to sign such a document according to some people. And if we remember a little bit of our history back in World War I, after the Germans had lost that war, there was this myth that became perpetuated that the German army and the high command wanted to keep fighting, but they were sold out by the politicians. And they were afraid that if a general, a lowly general, like Jodl were to sign, then this myth could be perpetuated again. They wanted people higher up the food chain, so to speak, to sign the actual documents. Negotiations go on back and forth. And when I say negotiations, I mean at the highest level, no intermediaries. You've got Truman, you've got Churchill, and you've got Stalin communicating back and forth with one another, trying to cajole, for the most part, Stalin into accepting this signing. We want to declare VE Day. Now, after General Jodl signed these documents, it came out over the German radio, we've surrendered. So the losing party broke the news, but none of the Allies confirmed it. So you sort of have people in this limbo, so to speak. Do we celebrate? Why aren't we confirming it? What's going on here? Well, eventually it was decided, all right, we will have another signing in Berlin, and that is why I've got the second capital and the second date up there. The next day, on May 8th, in Berlin, and this was in a former German Army engineering schoolhouse. Once again, the papers were laid out, and once again, there was a signing. So we've got two signings. Here, the next picture I got is of the first. This is General Jodl signing the capitulation papers in Reims. At this point, I'll paraphrase his quote. After he signed the paperwork, he said something to the effect that the German people or the German people and the German military, more so, had achieved and suffered more than anybody in the last 5 years. And he asked the Allies he asked them for mercy. Their response to him, I think, looking rather incredulous that the German military had achieved so much in 5 years, there was absolutely no response. He was shown the door. He walked into the next room where General Eisenhower was waiting for him. He was asked if he understood what he signed. He said yes, and he exits the stage. That was it. There was no party. Thank you, sir. You can be on your way. So there is Jodl signing the first paperwork. This is the actual paperwork itself, a copy thereof. You can see Jodl's handwritten signature there. Here is Field Marshal William Keitel. This is the man that we were really looking for. This is the name that we wanted on the dotted line and the Russians wanted on the dotted line. He was there for the second signing, the signing that took place in Berlin. And let's see, I've got my list of who all was there that day. Of course, the Russians wanting as most important dignitaries and high-up military officials as they could have there. Marshal Zhukov, he was there. For representing the Allies, we had Air Chief Marshal Tedder for the Western Allies. And then there were several signatures from the German side. You had Admiral von Friedberg. He was in charge of the Navy after Dönitz became Reichspresident. You also had General Stone from the Luftwaffe, and as I said previously, Field Marshal Keitel, Oberkommander der Wehrmacht. I don't think my German is nearly as good as Brooke's, but this was his title. So, May 8th, the surrender is to take effect at 23:01 hours Central German Time, May 8th, 1945. This is what we, those of us in the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Western Europe, will know as VE Day. But in the ultimate example of nothing is ever easy, timelines and datelines being what they are, the surrender did not take effect until after midnight in Russia and in Moscow. So of course the Russians still ended up celebrating VE Day on May 9th. And here we are. The newspapers, the celebrations, I'm sure we can all sort of imagine. I mean, you can see the newspapers here printing in color, a large VE, victory in Europe. We keep in mind that the war isn't over, but a large challenge has been overcome and Nazism has been defeated. So, obviously a momentous day. At this point, I've got just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to breeze very quickly through just a couple of quotes that I think are very illustrative of the mindset of those that were in power at the time. Those that were the decision makers, the generals, the prime ministers, etc. And these I'll try to make as brief as I can. This one being from Marshal Zhukov, representing the USSR. Many thoughts were passing through my mind in those happy times. A difficult battle for Moscow, where soldiers had been fighting to the death while not letting the enemy enter our capital. Stalingrad in ruins. Thousands of destroyed towns and villages, millions and millions of victims of the Soviet nation that survived and won. So here it is, or here it was, the final destruction of fascist Germany. The goal that we had sacrificed ourselves for the last 4 years. You can imagine the sort of sigh of relief after the millions upon millions. I do think it's rather interesting that if you would just take this quote by itself, you wouldn't actually recognize that there was anybody other than Russians fighting. Interesting thought, perhaps. The next quote, very short. Field Marshal General de Gaulle. The war is won, victory is yours. It is the victory of the United Nations and the victory of France. A little bit of recognition there for those who participated in the fighting. Not exactly a thank you like you might expect, but nonetheless. Now, of course, General Eisenhower. I think this quote, none better, illustrates why it is that General Eisenhower wasn't the man in charge. Let us have no part in profitless quarrels in which other men will inevitably engage as to what country, what service won the war in Europe. Every man, every woman of every nation here represented has served according to his or her ability, and the efforts of each nation have contributed to the outcome. He shares the congratulations for the hard work. He pats everybody on the back. I mean, can you imagine the tremendous responsibility that he had working with all the Allied nations to produce this outcome? And even in victory, he shares the glory. So, once again, I think this is why he had the job. And finally, just to sort of bring us back to earth a little bit and remind us that there was work to be done, Prime Minister Winston Churchill. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget for a moment the toil and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued. The war was not over. This was a portion. This was a very large portion, but there was still more to do. Prime Minister Churchill serves to remind us of that. But these are the people that made the command decisions. These are the people that got to be there for the paperwork. These are the people whose names we find in history books. But these people by no means tell the whole story. And as we mentioned before, and we're so glad to have, the people that actually did the fighting, the boots on the ground, the ones that flew the planes, the ones that drove the trucks, these are the people that really saw firsthand the consequences of that fighting in Europe. So it's at this point that I'd like to really just get right off the stage and ask these three gentlemen if you wouldn't mind coming on up and just sharing with us a little bit about what it was like. If you wouldn't mind sharing this piece of your life with us today, I think we'd all benefit and it would all add tremendously to our understanding of what VE Day really meant. So gentlemen, if you wouldn't mind. So as we see these gentlemen up to the stage here, we'll sort of take a few more of those pictures. These are the fellas here that, well, they got to share the kisses when the war was over in Europe. Maybe they finally got a chance to put their feet up. Of course, they had to load the trucks to go home. They climbed aboard the ships. And once they were back, of course, the welcome sight. So, Chuck, tell us about it. What was the experience that you had, sir?
We're going to talk in just a minute.
Okay, I got it. I just kind of want to work with Chuck. We haven't had a chance to get together on this yet. So basically, Chuck, as you heard, was a B-24 pilot. He bailed out, became a POW, and had a slightly earlier VE day. So could you start telling us, tell us about the bailout, about the ME-109s, and what happened, okay?
Well, won't be too difficult to tell you about the bailout. We fell out of the plane. No, we were hit over the target. We were bombing up in Germany. and we were hit over the target. And we thought we were going to go downwind. We didn't. We got control of the V-24 and flew it at a much lower altitude very slowly toward Italy. We hoped to make Italy, but we didn't. Unfortunately, it was a beautiful day, no clouds, except about 10 or 12 Messerschmitts that performed their duty toward their country by shooting us down. You may not know, but the generals of our general and the generals of the Germans had made an agreement. The B-24s or our bombers, if the bomber was so hurt, pardon me, if it was so beat up that it was not possible for it to continue to fly, the staff could drop the wheels and the fighters, the German fighters, would pull off and allow the Americans to bail out. Well, I never believed that would happen, but it did. So when we saw that we could not go any further, we gave the order to bail out because the Messerschmitts had been hitting us pretty hard, and several of us were wounded a little bit. So we bailed out. We were captured. I was captured by a group of farmers because they had seen the parachute coming down, and when I hit the ground, I could hardly walk. So we were captured, a bombardier and myself, and beat up a little bit, taken to their house nearby. And I thought they were going to go ahead and do away with us. But as they were marching us back out into the field, a truck came down the line, state truck, with some soldiers on it. They stopped the group, and we didn't realize it, but it was the Hungarian Air Force troops. They took us away from the people and took us to a Hungarian air base where we spent the night before. They sent us up to Germany, to Budapest, where the Germans had an office and were accepting prisoners from all over that area. And so we went up there. I went on a railroad car that was just terrible, jammed full of people. They sent us there to Stalag Luft 3, which was their main unit for Germans. A fellow prisoner wrote this book, this manual, day by day, as to what was happening for us as we made marches from one prison camp to another in inclement weather, and we finally arrived after about over 100 and some odd miles of marching in both bad weather and good weather to Stalag Luft 7. All prisoners in Germany were taken to Stalag Luft 7 because the Germans did not want the Russians to get a hold of us, thinking that we'd come back and fight again. So we were in Stalag 7 with about probably 25 to 30,000 prisoners of all nationalities. And we were there until one morning I heard gunfire. Big cannons going off. I didn't know what happened. I was sleeping outside in a dirty trench. We got up and we looked, and suddenly after hearing that gunfire, we saw our flag go down. The German flag went down and the American flag went up. You can imagine how I felt. 2 or 3 days later, General Patton himself came in on a tank with his 6 shooters and congratulated all of us for what we had done. It was very touching, and I remember vividly today. General Patton is my hero, and all of his troops and tank people are my heroes. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to know of, but, huh?
Let's see, March 4th, 1943, I was 17 years old and received my draft notice. March 6th was my birthday. I was in Omaha, Nebraska. That's where I was born. I'll never forget the physical because it was very cold and they didn't have a lot of heat in that room. I requested I wanted to be in the Navy, and they requested they want to be in the Army. 2 weeks later, I was in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, with a whole bunch of clothes that scratched very much and didn't feel good, but we got them all tailored. A week after that, I was sent to Fort Sheridan, Illinois, and discovered I was going to be a half-track driver and radio operator with the 6th Armored Division. Our batteries and battalion, if you see many pictures, was the 450s on one track and the 37 and 250s on the other. And we were called the 777th AAA Battalion, which made us the nickname the Lucky 37s, which we had to live up to all the way through. After a lot of training there and a lot of cold weather, went to Tennessee for more winter maneuvers, and they were training us to be in the South Pacific, so we had to sleep every night in our pup tents at 10 below with mosquito netting over the. So when we got through that training, we put it on our train and we headed for North Carolina, where we spent 3 weeks and picked up all new equipment, which was not the equipment we had trained on. This was completely different. So we went to school again for another month and come out of there pretty proficient. I drove the headquarter track of Battery A, 777. We went overseas on the New Amsterdam, a luxury liner, and it was not luxurious, but we got there. We came into Scotland, went all night by train and got down somewhere in central England. Next morning, they immediately pulled us, the aircraft outfit, detached us, and we drove to Bristol, down in Dover, and we spent about 3 or 4 weeks down there firing at the Buzzmouth. They just loved our guns because they were rapid fire and we could knock down Buzzmouth. We got a call to move out of there real rapidly and went to Membury, England, and set up protection around the airfield where the 101st and 92nd Airborne took off. We went from there. As soon as they jumped, we went from there, Portsmouth, got on the LST, and our outfit was dropped on Omaha Beach at D+10. Some of our guys that went in ahead of us, but we, thank goodness, were detached. We joined the 6th there and got assigned by General Patton to be the Spearhead Division, because General Grove was Patton's chief of staff at one time, so he would do anything that General Patton told him. So while they were still tied up there, we went through avalanches and headed out and captured captured Brest. And we moved fast. We made it from the landing to Brest in about 10 days. And we were surrounded. We were the division Patton was looking for, told us by air, but they dropped us gasoline by air so we could continue. From that point on, we found out after 3 weeks that Brest was not going to fall. They were going to stay. So we went across and got involved on all the way across France, the Siegfried Line. At that time, it was Christmas of 43. I think I got that day right. We were all getting ready for our first hot turkey dinner. And at noon on Christmas Day, we were on march order for Bastogne. We went about 42 hours on drive to Bastogne. After we got to Bastogne, we discovered, we went with the 2nd Armored and we relieved Bastogne. And here come the 101st and 92nd out of Bastogne on foot. Believe me, they need to be honored. So we went from there and we spent a lot of time moving, and coming up to about April 14th on 1945, we moved in to the village I noticed on there of Roden, R-O-H-D-E-N. Very surprised. We thought we were going to have to fight to take us. Real close to the Elbe River, and they just loved us. They welcomed us with surrender flags, and we got everybody smiling, and we thought we were back in France rather than Germany. We discovered they were so happy because the Russians, they did not want to take the town, and the Russians were moving very rapidly. We stayed in Roden, and they kept negotiating, and finally the 69th was picked to meet the Russians, a very select group, and what happened was they went to meet the Russians. Immediately after they met the Russians, the armistice wasn't signed. We pulled back to a staging area and were told that just wait. And then we, after the armistice was signed, then it was, we could stage our tracks and get ready to come home. We discovered that the Russians did continue their attack, and they leveled Roden after we left there, which was kind of a shame. Anyway, when we got the note to the armistice was signed, I had we parked our tracks, all got together in one big field for the first time since we got there, and had a great time for about a week, and then discovered that those gentlemen who had volunteered were going to go home first. And us who had not volunteered, I was assigned a number would be discharged in 6 months. So I got my, I got attached to 99th Infantry, a communications group, and we spent our time going around through the villages, re-establishing the communications, climbing the telephone poles, putting up the lines again. And doing that, we ramped in groups of 3. We had a Jeep, 50 caliber machine gun, and we would just go out and roam and find out where the lines were down, put them back up again. But we also discovered there was quite a few deserting German troops who did not trust that the war was completely over. So they still carried their guns, and we ran into a few of them. And I'll close with one quick story. We were out working the telephone lines, and we drew some fire from a German silo. So we returned the fire. I was on the 50 that day, and I was knocking the shingles off the top of the silo. I think we discouraged the German soldier because he went out the back door and disappeared. And we were continually trying to talk to him. Our sergeant could speak German, and we would tell him the war was over and trying to get him to surrender. But we didn't see him, he disappeared. So we went up to the silo, and Milo, my associate, he went inside, and I let out a large scream, and we rushed in. We thought he was in trouble. And this silo was pretty airtight. It was beautifully built. There was 3 decks, and every deck had 3-star Hennessy cognac, German, French, Portuguese wines, and French liqueurs. Well, we had a particular problem then because we wanted to get as much of this first before the officers got it. So what we did was, we weren't supposed to drive the half tracks anymore, but we snuck back to our bivouac area, and I got my track. I still had the key to it. We right away pulled out with the trailer. Well, we had taken all the ammunition out of the half tracks, so what we did was we backed the trailer up and we loaded that thing as full as we could with everything that we thought everybody would like to drink. And then we took off and took it back to our bivouac area. Well, called the lieutenant and the first sergeant over, and they came apart at the seams. You know, they said, well, we got to put a guard around this, nobody can touch it. The lieutenant said, look, you go with me, and you got to show me where this is. So I went with him, showed him. He brought an MP up there and put him on guard. That was it for that. That was going to the officers. I got back to the bivouac area, and of course Milo had told some of the guys that we weren't supposed to touch it, but all of a sudden the back door was open half right. Here's all the guys going out with the booze. So anyway, to bring this to an end, and thank you for this honor of being here. My next 6 months of occupation duty was very smooth and very comfortable. Thank you.
The war, if I was still there, we'd get married, which we did. She wrote a book. I wrote a lot of letters home to her. She wrote a book about the letters that I sent her. And it's being sold here. She published it 7 years ago. It's still selling. It's called Laura's War. I was able to learn or remember more about what I actually did from those letters. But time being what it is, let me tell you a fast story. I had to go to Fort Benning to go through the officers training, which I did. And I got my commission when I was 20 years old. And we went to the 69th Division for several months for training after we got out of there. And then we were sent to the eastern coast. I can't go into, this is top secret, I can't go into what city that was, but we got on a vessel. It was a White Star liner, fairly big, had a lot of passenger room, and every passenger we had on that boat was a second lieutenant, everyone. Because we sort of settled down with the thought that maybe they need them. But the war had been going on a while, and this is the end of April, and we were being hurriedly sent to Europe. So we got there and we had three buddies, myself, Strickland, I was called Stretch, and we had Harry Tripp. And Strick and Stretch was like a vaudeville act. We were together prior to being called on the speaker, and they were calling out saying, Joe Blow, you're going in the 6th Armored Division, so-and-so, you're going in this and that. And they were giving APO numbers. You're with APO 1,500, you're with APO 56. And then it came to Wayne Hoffman, Strick, and Tripp, lieutenants all, and we were APO 1. And we thought, you know, there's something very strange about that, but what the hell will we remember this number anyway? Well, we found out that number 1 was the big red one, the 1st Infantry Division. And they were getting ready to make the invasion of Normandy, and we were there to fill in some gaps. They had invaded at Oran in 42. They fought Rommel. At the end of that, in 43, July of 43, they made the invasion of Sicily. They finished that, and then, being a senior division with a lot of battle experience, they sent them back to England for training for the invasion. And we joined them at that, for that mission and on. And we stayed up until, with two exceptions, I stayed, let me put it that way, until the end of the war. Winged a couple of small times, but we fought from Normandy to the end of the war. Never had a rest area, and for various reasons, if I have a moment, I'll tell you why. But today is April 17th, and my closest buddy was Lieutenant Strickland. He was a day older than I was, so he outranked me. And we were both second lieutenants and got to be first lieutenants, and then he was offered to become a captain. And he was killed on today's date, 65 years ago. Strick had been killed. Harry had been killed in the Hurtgen Forest, and so 2 out of the 3 of us were gone when the war ended. When the war ended, I got into discussions, people that might have kept statistics, and I said, okay, how many men do we have in this division? It's 15,000 men. And how many men went through the division in World War II? And he said 45,000 men. And it's interesting to hear these stories. On the very last day of action, we used to get replacements as often as we could and needed. And we got a second lieutenant, 20 years old, named Barker. And he's on our excuse me, he was killed that day, that last day. He had arrived off the boat, where they usually had a white stripe mark on the back of their helmet. When they arrived, you'd know that this was somebody green and what to do with them. And we were actually had touched by that stage with the Russians. We go to a party and this and that at the request of our leaders. And this lad showed up. I never met him. He was killed. So, with Strick going on April 17 and this one on the last day of the war, you can understand how the Big Red One operated. We didn't end the war until the war ended for us. And we were appointed the Guard of Honor at Nuremberg. And we then all went to Nuremberg. And we were all screaming to go home. People say, well, wasn't it a wonderful feeling when the war was over? And we said, well, no. And they said, well, what do you mean by that? Well, because at the end of the war, until about 6 months later, we were screaming we wanted to go home. And we never got to, even those of us who had been seniors and had a lot of the points that would get you home. The war was brutal. 6th Division, 6th Armored Division, as mentioned, we were in most difficult battle, probably, forget Normandy for a minute, was the Battle of the Bulge, where we had 80,000 casualties, more than they had in the Civil War in any battle. And the 6th Armored Division had a wonderful reputation with us. I was in a bed for the first time, having come out of action temporarily. We went to this place in Belgium, and I got in there, and I was able to take a shower. I was able to get some clean clothes, and at night I had feather covers. And I was there, and the door, somebody's banging on the door and said, "Lieutenant, report to battalion in full battle gear." And it's the middle of the night. So I go over and I said, "What's going on?" He said, "The Germans have broken through." And I said, "Where?" And he said, "We're about 20 miles behind them." And later I learned that the 82nd Airborne and the 101st were behind us a few miles. And then all of a sudden I got told to get out of bed and go there, and we had to find the commanding general of the 2nd Division, which keeps taking a terrible beating here for a day and a half, and we were the two of us were to get up there, find him, and tell him that the 1st Division was on its way. And my colonel, who was a wonderful soldier, I said, "Well, how can we tell him that?" He said, "Because we will be on our way. As soon as you leave, we'll be on our way." It turned out we had to fight our way in because the Germans had broken through those lines, and they were way behind us where we were trying to go. So we had to actually get ourselves organized and fight our way through to get where we were going to start fighting. And then at when we finally did that job, we were asked by Ridgway, well, we weren't asked, we were told Ridgway that, told us, that the 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne, and the 1st Infantry Division would counterattack. We had beaten the enemy. They were no longer able to go forward, and we thought, first time, by God, I'm going to get back into a feather bed. When the general showed up and said, "We're going to counterattack," I said to one of my buddies, "You know, that's kind of thoughtless. Why in the hell would they do that? Down to half the people. We hadn't had any food because we were dealing in below zero weather, and we had nothing but these cans of stuff, and we couldn't get the cans open. And we were supposed to blow holes with little pieces of dynamite, and they just poofed up, and we couldn't. So we didn't have any holes, and we were running around like chickens with our head off. It was a tough war. And the 82nd and the 101st and the 1st Division had been in the same battle together at Normandy. So this is what the fighting was for some of us. A lot of people died. A lot of your friends were gone. Yet you had to keep going. And those of us who think in terms of, you know, well, this was easy because the Russians were doing this, and the Germans were getting weaker and weaker. And we seemed to find out that every time we got into a firefight with them, they had full strength and they weren't weak at all. And we got weaker as they're going went, and so did they. That was the beginning and end of my short speech on World War II.
Chuck Wally wanted to make one further comment, and then we'll wrap it up so we can get into the flight demonstration.
I would be remiss if I didn't do this. For those of you who thought I went through a lot in those prison camps, I want you to know that I married Dottie Lawley just before I went overseas. We've been married 66 years, and she spent the 11 months wondering whether I would ever live, and that's difficult. So I love Dottie.
Listen, thank you fellas very much. These are wonderful stories. Wow. I'm glad we're all here today. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Greg Kenny now to wrap it up. Personally, I want to thank all of you for being here.
Hey, is there any doubt why they call this the greatest generation? There's absolutely none in my mind. And speaking of that, if we have any veterans with us here today or active duty military, if you're able to stand, if you please could, or at least raise your hand so that we may recognize you, and thank you for your service. We are so appreciative. Thank you very much. As Brooke said, we've got the flight exhibition. It's going to get started right through these doors. Of course, the cafe is open today. Stop by and check out a new little display we've got going over there. It's got radio broadcasts from all throughout the war, so there's still plenty of stuff to see and do today. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Isn't it wonderful to have a archivist and historian right here to help us out today? So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.